Okay, welcome to History of the Middle East with Dr. Brovkin. We'll continue today to talk about the Crusades. Last time we discussed the First Crusade, how it started, the letter of Alexei, Urban II, and then the two streams, Peter the Hermit, and the deal of the major leaders of the Crusade, Godfrey and other dukes and nobility of Europe coming, mostly French, coming to Antioch and then to Jerusalem. Finally, the crucial moment, 1099, they do take Jerusalem and it starts with a massacre. But the next point today, what we should discuss is the actual, what do they do there? I mean, it's like 18 more years that they stay in Jerusalem. And if we count Christian rule in the rest of the coast, in Tyre and in Sidon and many other cities along the coast, it's even more. It's 250 years. So there's a continuous, long presence of the Europeans in the Middle East. And this is what I'd like to talk a little bit about today. And then their relations with the Fatimids, which is also their neighbors. There's the border. They do come in contact. And what is the relationship? What is the contact of the Christian European knights and the Fatimids in Egypt or today's Palestine? So here's important things to say, something that I have already said. Number one, they do not want to convert everybody to Christianity. They do not engage in missionary activity. This is something that the Spanish would do a few hundred years later in America, but that's not what they do. What they really are busy with is solidifying their presence, which means building fortresses. So even to the present day, all over Middle East, there are Crusader fortresses. And I saw one, as a matter of fact, one of the most interesting ones is in Acre, which is a city in Israel on the coast. And it's absolutely fascinating. The fortress looks exactly as it was then. And there's a hall there. And I was in that hall where Richard the Lionheart with his knights were sitting in 1190 something when Richard the Lionheart came to Jerusalem to defend it against Saladin. It's absolutely a fascinating feeling because it looks exactly as it did. That is the hall where Richard the Lionheart sat 1,000 years ago. So it's absolutely fascinating. So what they do, they build fortresses. In order to defend if there's any attack on their possession. The next thing they do is they engage in trade. And this is also extremely important for the history of Europe because this is a kind of a cultural contact. The Europeans, when they came to the Middle East, they discovered all kinds of things that to their amazement, the Orientals, the locals, knew better how to do. Well, among other things, it was medicine. They discovered that the Middle Eastern doctors, both Jews and Arabs, were by far more advanced than the European ones. And a famous case is when Richard the Lionheart got sick, Saladin, as a gentleman, he sent his doctor to take care of Saladin. Another example I read, which is fascinating too, is that when a knight was wounded in one of the battles, the European doctor basically ordered to chop off the rest of his hand so that it doesn't get infected. And this knight died of bleeding. In a similar case, the Arab doctor brought all kinds of anesthetic and leaves of plants and things, and the wound healed. In other words, they were by far superior in handling medical emergencies such as wounds. Most importantly, the Europeans discovered they became cleaner. They started to use baths just as the Middle Easterners do. And that culture of bath actually spread to Europe. One can claim that the European began to wash themselves better and to take baths and things as they picked up that culture of Turkish bath, or now it's Moroccan hammam, or any one of those cultures in the Middle East. Spices was another great thing. This is the beginning of European imports of spices from the Middle East, and such delicacy that I still like to eat every day is dates and figs and these other plants that were totally unknown to the Europeans. So this is where you have very, very important exposure to commerce by the military knights. So we will hear specifically about Hospitaliers and Templars, but I want to speak here about that banking, which also developed greatly because of the Middle East and because of the necessity to carry valuables. So let me give you an example. Suppose there is a knight somewhere in France, and he wants to go to join the Crusaders in Jerusalem. Well, normally the way he would go, the easiest way to go, which is described in the movie, the Kingdom of Heaven, you basically go to the south of Italy, and then you take a boat to Greece, and then you traverse Greece to Constantinople, and then from Constantinople you either take a boat or you go on the sea, along the Mediterranean. Or you could simply take a boat directly from Italy, which is most of the time they did, was just cutting the continental trip by taking a ship. So this is how the banking works. If you take your money with you, then if you die, then nobody knows who is going to take that money. So suppose you have some gold coins and some other valuables. There's a danger that you might be robbed or that you might discover something bad, misfortune on the way. And then if you carry your money with you, they'll be lost. A much safer way would be to come to the office of Templars somewhere in France. Like there's a museum that I saw of Templars in Figeac, which is a town in the Midi, and you give them the money. You say, "Here's my money." So it's like a deposit in the bank, and then they say, "That's fine. When you come to Jerusalem, here's the letter. You go to such and such a person in Templar's office, and they'll give you your money." Well, this is pretty much modern banking. The Templar, and take a commission, they take money for that service. But the service is basically that your money is safe and you don't need to carry it. The Templars will provide you with the amount that you need because you deposited it in France. So the significance of that, of course, is that it makes number one, it makes Templars really, really rich. By some accounts, by 1400s, they became richer than some kings in Europe and richer than the Pope. But it's not only that, it's introduction of modern banking that would be very, very important later in the Middle Ages, in the Mediterranean, that would be used by the Venetian and by the Florence merchants that would make them very rich at the time of the Renaissance. So banking is and of course commerce. Their ships were carrying not just the knights. Their ships were carrying all kinds of goods from the Middle East and made a bundle of money on this trade. So the exposure to the Orient, culture, medicine, spices, all of that was great, great influence on the Europeans, and the good one, and the positive one. And later on, it was not just the physical arts, it was also the philosophy. In a sense, it's the beginning, was something would grow into Renaissance. In 1400, Pope Nicholas ordered, this is already not this topic, but just to tell you how important Middle East is. He ordered his ships to go anywhere in the Middle East and buy any books he could for any amount of money. So they were beginning to realize that the valuable books, the writings of Aristotle and others, were saved by Arab scholars, and they were in the libraries of Alexandria and Cairo and Jerusalem and Constantinople. So this is also another proof of the contact of cultures that was extremely important, that these books began to come to Europe. Now, the military power. They're building the fortresses, and their military power is based pretty much, as we discussed before, not so much on technology, because they're not ahead technologically, not at all, but on their cavalry charge, because their military culture is based on this armor, and the cavalry charge, whenever they had encounters with the Fatimids or with the Turks, they would beat them. If they were exposed, if they didn't have armor, then the archers, the Turkish archers, were insurpassable. And in a light combat, then the Turks were masters of saber use. But in a charge with spears, it would be like a tank that couldn't be stopped, and their cavalry charge of the knights in armor would be totally unstoppable. And this is how they won many of these battles. In any case, now let me talk about the relationship with the Fatimids. As we've discussed, from 1094 to 1121, the ruler of Fatimid Egypt is Al-Afdal, who is a vizier, and there's a minor caliph who is basically has no power, because Al-Afdal is ruling. Al-Afdal at first did not fear the Crusaders. He didn't think that they're a big deal. In fact, they wanted to create an alliance with the Fatimids against the Turks, because it is the Seljuk Turks who controlled Damascus, who actually threatened the territory of Fatimid Egypt, and they did fight over Jerusalem a couple of times. It changed hands from the Fatimids to the Seljuk Turks. In 1121, there was a new caliph. Caliph Al-Amin ordered the murder of Al-Afdal. He grew up, he got tired of the constant control of his vizier, and he was killed. Al-Afdal was killed, and Al-Amir becomes a ruler in his own right, and he would rule to 1130. What's very important here is that there was a historical record of one of the meetings of the Crusaders with a caliph. Presumably it would be Al-Afdal. Al-Amin. It's a very interesting description, because it shows this kind of a interaction of cultures. So what we have is a record provided by the Crusaders how the meeting took place, that they came to the palace and they couldn't see the caliph, and he was veiled and he couldn't be seen and touched, and the courtiers asked them to kneel, and they wouldn't. They said, no, we could only kneel before our own king. And then finally they did conclude an agreement, and so the knights asked the caliph to shake a hand, and the caliph had no idea about this practice or anything like that. He said, "What is that? I'm not going to do it." And the knights said, "Look, this is our tradition. When we conclude a deal, we shake hands, and we insist. Otherwise, the deal is not valid." And so the caliph had to he stretched out his head from behind a veil, and so stretched it out as if to have it kissed, and it was in a glove. And the knight said, no, you have to take off your glove, and you have to open up your face, and we have to see eye to eye, and we have to shake your hand. And he didn't want to do any of it, but eventually he did. He took off his glove, he unveiled his face, and there was a handshake. So this is one of those interesting moments. The next thing, let's focus a little bit about the last decades of the Fatimid rule in Egypt. So essentially what happens is that they kept losing to Crusaders. And in 1153, Ascalon, a very important border city, was lost, which means the Crusaders took it and kept building fortresses. And this is the beginning of another round of troubles in Egypt that would lead to the demise, a collapse of the Fatimid dynasty. So if you want to have a date, this is the date, 1153, 1154. So 1154, a new caliph is Al-Zafir, and he was murdered by his vizier, and his vizier doesn't feel very confident, and he invites in 1162 a new vizier who is a very important person, you have to remember his name is Shavar, Shawar, Shavar. So he is the vizier, and he will be the last one, the ruling vizier. And there's chaos in Cairo. There's constant struggle about claimants to be caliph. There's rebellions. There's expansion of Crusader territory. There's failure of the crop. There's kind of close to chaos situation. And Shavar asks help. As there was a time, remember, 50 years earlier, when Mustanzir asked for help from Syria, from a friend there, who comes in, and this is exactly what happens now. Shavar asks for help from a ruler in Damascus, and his name is Nureddin. Nureddin is the ruler in Damascus. So Shavar asks, goes to Syria, comes back with the Syrian, and his commander of the Syrian force is Shirkur, Shirkur, Shirkur. So Shavar is the vizier, Shirkur is the commander of the Syrian troops that come with him to claim control in Cairo. Okay, so Shirkur wants to actually rule, just like the case with Gamali, he wants to rule Egypt himself. And this is the moment when they also conclude an alliance with the Crusaders, and the ruler of the Crusaders, king of Jerusalem, is Amalric the First. And this is the crucial moment for the history of Crusaders. So Shavar wants the alliance with Fatimids, with the Crusaders to oppose the force of the Turks and their ruler Nur al-Din. The place is called Bilbais. So in Bilbais you have this triangular struggle. Shirkur, the person from Damascus, is besieged by the combined force of the Fatimids, the Egyptians, and Crusaders. The reason I emphasize it's so important, if the Crusaders had defeated the Syrians, Shirkur, then the history of the Middle East would have been different. Because, as you will see, what happens is that they didn't, which means Crusaders failed to take over Egypt. Egypt was not theirs, and not only it wasn't theirs, it wasn't going to be Fatimids. It's going to be taken over by Nur al-Din. It's going to be taken over by Nur al-Din's nephew, Saladin. So, in Bilbais is the chance for the Crusaders to take over, to win and take over Cairo. And then their position would have been superior. They could have changed the history of the Middle East and the history of Crusades and the history of the world if they had won at that time and established control over Cairo. But they didn't. And the Shirkur did win. And in 1167, after he recovered somewhat from this battle, which was 1164, Shirkur invades with his own troops. He invades Cairo, invades Egypt. And there's a battle, in a place called Babain, 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 1167, when Shirkuh wins. And now Shirkuh, the nephew of Nur al-Din, is, sorry, not the nephew, it would be Saladin the nephew. Sorry, Shirkuh, the commanding officer, whose boss is Nur al-Din in Damascus. He is now in Cairo. He controls Egypt. But then, uh, all of a sudden, he dies, and one of his officers, who is a nephew of Nur al-Din, takes over. My suspicion is that Shirkuh died not out of old age. Most likely, Saladin engineered this thing, and Shirkuh dies, and his officer, whose name is Saladin, who is the nephew of Nur al-Din, is now a vizier of Egypt. So he basically controls Egypt, and that means that Nur al-Din in Damascus and Saladin in Cairo is one force. They control the territory all around the kingdom of Jerusalem, which already creates conditions for Saladin that would be very favorable eventually to confront the Crusaders, which he will, and we shall see later in a different uh, study how he did it. But to conclude the point now, the fact that the Europeans failed to establish control over Cairo is the beginning of their undoing, is the beginning of the end, because Syria and Egypt are now one under Nur al-Din Saladin, and then they're going to prevail and win in the end. Thank you. And do not forget to subscribe to History of the Middle East with Dr. Brovkin, and ring the bell and put your likes at the end.